I am Chaobang. I wander the worlds. And tonight I have been invited to share a few reflections on two of the most difficult peoples in this one. Two civilizations, which, alas, in a different reality, might have been my home. I was born in their inheritance, and I grew up at their intersection. Yet I found belonging in neither, because both are afflicted by a system of mythic narratives designed, by definition, to alienate. A system with which you will all be quite familiar by now. The myth of the chosen people. Now, this term chosen people comes, I understand, from the Judeo-Christian tradition. I mean, something to do with some guy called Moses. I don't know, probably not important. But anyway, this is the core idea of a people cosmically blessed with superiority over all other peoples has taken many forms and been known by many names. There can be no doubt that its most problematic in these present centuries is what we might call the white supremacy. That is the dominance of certain parts of the populations of West European powers and their settler societies like the United States and Australia, as built upon racist ideological structures and genocidal oppression. Yet this is also far from the only example pertinent to the past and future of humankind. I would therefore like to explore the manufacture of the chosen people story in perhaps the one civilization which has caused the greatest damage with it, the English, and then to put them in parallel with another rather different chosen people story, to examine the myth's broader significance. So what I am going to do is I am going to open a rift, and you can all go through one by one, and here we are in England. It's England. Sorry about that. This is Runnymede on the River Thames. There you go, green and pleasant land, very wonderful. Yeah? I can tell you, actually, as the name suggests, this is muddy as hell. You know, this wrecked my walking boots. You know, I do 3 separate sessions with the magical stuff in bottles just to clean it off. Anyway, Runnymede is an almost hallowed place in the English national imagination, and I gather just as much in that of the Americans, because it was here in the year 1215 that a certain despotic king called John, it is said, was cornered by his angry barons and forced to put his seal to a great Charter of Liberties, or as it is better known, a Magna Carta. All of a sudden goes the English national romance, the intrinsic excellence in the English's genetic code magically awakened in marvelous configurations never before seen in human history. Miracles like freedom and accountability and democracy, and most of all, rule of law. So they imagined that the English burst forth from that primal mass of barbarians and dictators that everyone else was still stuck in, to become the world's first politically enlightened civilization. And indeed, if you go to Runnymede today, you'll see signs and plaques everywhere that boast of 800 years of the rule of law, or proclaim Runnymede as nothing less than the birthplace of freedom. Really, it is true, it's true. The Irish among us should already have spotted a problem here. Our good friend Brendan Tobin recently spoke to us about the Brehon law systems by which people in ancient Ireland exercised constraints upon and, if necessary, removed their rulers. Indeed, most, if not all, human histories can be told of as stories of struggles to hold tyrannical power to account. If that was what the Magna Carta was about, it was one of many, one of a kind. Thing is, it wasn't even that. Freedom, democracy, rule of law, these would have been utterly alien concepts to the barons who confronted King John here, just as they would continue to be to most English people over the oppressive and violent centuries since, and as indeed they still are to many today, especially if if you're poor, on a low income, or if you're black with a policeman in front of you, or if you're a woman or an immigrant or neurodivergent, or anyway, that will take nine months if we go that way. The point is, these barons did not represent the people or some concept of the public good. but rather a class of powerful interests in a messy proto-England of shifting borders and seething intrigues and tangled webs of give-and-take feudal power relationships. In that context, there was actually quite little remarkable about the Magna Carta. Really, it was just one more in the set of endless give-and-take confrontations who claimed authority over the country on the one hand, and the powerful barons and priests who actually ran its business on the other. The Magna Carta was not about expanding their rights, it was about protecting their privileges. Not, that is, about any higher constitutional principle, but about one thing: power. And that the English and their offshoot societies all but worship the Magna Carta points not to its historical importance, but to the power of the myths that would be woven onto it later in their stories for political purposes, especially at key junctures such as the English Civil Wars, the American War of Independence, and the later attempts to justify the British Empire as a civilizing project. In those crucibles, the Magna Carta became the template for something new, a myth of political chosenness. Now, the England of 1215 would have been unrecognizable to the English today. Any mass national consciousness as a people was still centuries away. King John and the barons quarreled not in English, but in French. And crucially, it looked completely different on maps. This is the River Lee, which flows through what is now East London. And here it probably looks quite ordinary. I mean, you guys are probably all on their boats, arguing about Brexit and, cuddling their dogs or, whatever it is these people do. But actually, till not long before the Magna Carta, this was in effect a political border, an international border between a succession of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and, for a time, the Scandinavian Danelaw. That disorder was only further complicated by the Norman invasion of 1066, so that for a very long time, England was a multi-ethnic, shifting mass of territories that extended as far south through what is now France as it did north through the island of Britain. There then ensued a long and traumatic conflict with the rising kingdom of France, in which the English would be kicked off the continent piece by piece, till by around the end of the 14th century, they had been all but relegated to this island. Now, why is that important? As we watch them today, as they go Borising out of the European post-war peace settlement, or, watching a few refugees cross the channel and panicking that it's an invasion, the image that comes together, of which they speak of frequently, in fact, is this image of themselves as an island country. An island country, that is to say, England is imagined as a civilization apart, as though the channel separates it not just geographically, but morally, indeed cosmically, from the barbarous hordes on the continent. And yet, there's nothing geographically determined about this island country image. I mean, well, the Irish have an island too. They don't imagine themselves as a world apart in this kind of way. Just like them, the English are in fact a people defined by their connections with the outside world and with their arrivals from elsewhere. A cosmopolitan reality onto which they have superimposed a manufactured mythic concept of the gated magical island. A concept which makes no geographic sense until England's 15th century defeat and territorial expulsion from the European mainland, and its decision thereafter to build a new consciousness for itself as a people apart, a chosen people. Chosen people in a new consciousness which in the century to follow would infuse the Tudor dynasty's laying of the foundations for a chosen English modernity. Right, now, here we come to Hampton Court, and we're not going to spend very long here because this is the layer of one of the big beasts of the English story, who they call King Henry VIII and who I call a monumental dickhead. I mean, I intensely dislike this fellow. You see, he's a pain. I just frankly can't be bothered with this whole drama of his murderous relationship practices and his obsession with getting a male successor, which set off the bloody intergenerational shambles that was the English Protestant Revolution. But this was quite an important moment, we have to admit, in the English invention of chosenness. In effect, what this Henry Tudor did was to conclusively break English religious affairs from the traditional authority of the Catholic Church in Rome. Instead, English Christianity, and more crucially, and sort of by extension, the English spiritual imagination, was now centralized at axe point under the power of the English monarchy. This was a notoriously violent process, and many of you are probably aware, as Henry's minions, directed by his ruthless but undoubtedly formidable chief minister Thomas Cromwell, went up and down the country, smashing monasteries, plundering their treasures, demanding explicit personal loyalty to the king, and quite often making gruesome public examples of those people who stood on their consciences and refused. Now, as a religious settlement, given that this was all ultimately for the sake of Henry's dynastic ego and not any higher constitutional vision, it was totally inconclusive. It would mire the English in generation after generation to come of Catholic Protestant conflicts, persecutions, and terrors. But more lastingly, perhaps, what Henry VIII and Cromwell pulled off was not just an assault on a bunch of monks chanting in cloisters. It was a full-scale demolition, as much of a system of inherited stories and mythic imaginations as it was of buildings and bodies. It set down a pattern that would repeat on an ever more destructive scale when it later expanded beyond English shores. A pattern that is of casting everyone else's cultural and narrative content as inferior, as the other, as subversive, as illegitimate to be called content at all, with nothing to be learned from it, and thus fit only to be utterly wiped away and replaced by the English's superior, chosen methods and stories. And when those religious conflicts finally resolved, this English chosenness had become a demanding state Protestant chosenness, with no tolerance for anyone who disagreed, least of all, other Protestants whose Protestantism was even just like a slightly bit different from state Protestantism. I'm sure, those of you in the US will know this best of all, because there were a lot of people who did disagree, and they were really pissed off. And so they got on ships and sailed away to get themselves chosen somewhere else instead, somewhere with indigenous people. And from there, you all know the story. This potentiality of chosenness was made atrociously real upon the ships and plantations of the transatlantic slave trade, the depredations of the East India Company, and the conquests of the British colonial empire. Yet we're not quite finished, because I believe there was one crucial further moment, perhaps the most crucial of all, which raised the English chosen people myth to its very darkest heights. It was that moment, towards the end of the 19th century, when English chosenness was built into something far more sinister. White chosenness. We speak, of course, of the creation of race. And by race, we should be very clear what we mean. Not just the casual, hostile division of people into us and them, but a more systematic, universalizing project to create a hierarchical separation of essential superior and inferior peoples under the language and guise of modern science. That's the crucial part. The notion of race was assembled out of a cocktail of theories and discoveries that fused together in the heat of the scientific revolution, especially the revolution in the understanding of the origins of life, including of humans, as brought about by Charles Darwin. What seems to have happened was that Darwin's discoveries were abused to tell a story of all life, including human life, as a ruthless competition for survival, a struggle between winners and losers, in which racial categories, fixed categories, inheritable categories of human beings, that is, hierarchies of heritable chosenness and not chosenness existed as scientific fact. And with it, the idea that the fitter superior races, the chosen races, which of course they meant their own, were destined to prevail in this struggle over the sort of unfit, inferior, not chosen races, by which of course they meant colonized people in Africa and Asia, and actually not too uncommonly in their stories, Ireland as well. This was eugenics, and eugenics was seen then as a serious and worthy science. By its logic, the extermination of the inferior not chosen made for an improvement in the quality and strength of the human gene pool, thus doing nothing less than casting genocide as both a natural process and an ethical, even humanitarian imperative. Genocide went from something to feel guilty about to something to be proud of. Proud of, that is, till it reached its consummation under Hitler and the Nazis and turned round to bring its apocalypse back to Europe. Make no mistake, the Nazis did not pull white supremacist eugenics out of a void, nor did it die in the bombed-out ruins of their Reich. What is so often conveniently forgotten is that English scientists like Francis Galton, Herbert Spencer, and educated and respected English public opinion were pivotal in setting up the ideologies of race in the first place. What then happened in Germany was not a corruption of the theories and practices hammered out in England and the US, but a faithful development of them, as the long ascent of this chosen people mythology at last broke through the ceiling into realms of cosmic horror. And there surely it remains today, because afterwards, as they did their work to cast the story of World War II as a heroic struggle of good versus evil, with civilization and democracy triumphant, that old genocidal mythology on which they had actually built their modernity crept on. And amidst the horrors of the early 21st century, amidst even the nightmares we've been watching this very week, who can claim now that we do not still live in its maw? And that, as they say, is that. I shall say no more for now on the mythic history of the English. If you would like to explore these stories further, then be informed that I have recently completed a critical walking history book, which I have provisionally titled In Search of the English, and which I am currently attempting to get published. Let me show you what I have done with this. A critical walking history around there's a sort of outskirts of the core of English power. So, of course, if you know any publishers who might be interested and, not put off by the fact it's about 500 pages, then, do feel free to get in contact. And in the meantime, I would invite you also to consult my ongoing expedition up the Thames River, the link to which I shall put in the chat box now. It's all on my blog. There we go. The 6th article, in particular, looks at length at the Magna Carta mythology that we have just been discussing. Be sure to save the link if you're interested before you head off into your groups. And I shall see you again when you are done, that we might journey on to look at a quite different chosen people.